Hey, good to see you
Good.
again. How are things?
How are you doing? Long time no see.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. I assume you're still here in Southern California, correct?
Yes, in the big fog. I'm very close to you, so I suppose you have the same fog I do.
Yeah, it was a little overcast and chilly. I took the dogs for I usually take them for about a 45-minute to an hour walk, and I did that this morning. It was kind of
It's lovely. I
chilly
love
and
it.
overcast and foggy, but yeah. So it's been I think it's been at least a year since has it been a year since we chatted or something like that?
The last time, I think it was about a year, and then before that, a couple of times, even longer ago.
That's right. Okay. Well, how are things for you? Anything new or different in the since we
No,
last chatted?
everything is okay. Everything is going fine, and life is great. Lots of good, fun stuff, good food, and good life. How about you?
That's good to hear. We've got something. We're probably going to be moving from California here, interestingly enough. So in
Oh,
fact,
where are you moving to?
we're going to probably be moving up to the Seattle area as it just kind of works for my better half's work. I'm pretty mobile where I can be, but she really probably needs to go up there for what she does with work. So we're actually flying up later this week to look at some homes and stuff. So
Very good.
anyway, probably about a
It's a nice place up there. So
it is. It's a little. The weather's a little rainier and cooler, but that's okay.
yeah, yeah.
So, headaches are obviously your sort of specialty. Um, you've been well. Let's just kind of go over this for people who haven't heard this before because I think it's important. You focused on migraine headaches, and can you based upon what you figured out over the years, what do you believe is causing them, and what is the way you fix them? Let's just kind of get into that real quick.
Okay, so migraines are not really headaches, so we have to distinguish there. There are a lot of migraines that don't even come with headaches. So it is the genetic condition, but it is basically a channelopathy. And to get back to what that is, it's basically the ionic channels in the brain don't work the same way as for a healthy, or rather, I shouldn't say unhealthy, I should say as an average typical human without this kind of variant. It's not a variant that should hurt. And the only reason it hurts is because of the carbohydrates that we consume and because we are not taking enough salt. And channelopathy, particularly for migraineurs, is associated with the ionic channels of sodium, potassium, the pumps that actually operate the brain. So if we provide the proper amount of sodium in balance with the proper potassium and magnesium, and we reduce or completely eliminate carbohydrates, then we also stop disturbing the electrolyte in general. And it is the electrolyte that its variance is the one that is responsible for the discomfort associated with migraine, be it pain or aura or anything else. There are hundreds of different symptoms. And so it's preventable by the proper diet.
Yeah, let me just, because, at first you said migraines are not headaches, and a lot of people say, well, my head hurts when I have a migraine. So what you're saying is migraines can appear in many different ways, one of which can be a headache. Right. And so this channelopathy, you're saying in the absence of a carbohydrate-based diet, you can have this channelopathy and not experience the pain in the head. Is that what I was hearing you say?
Right. And so the best example that I can give you this to fully understand is people, for example, from the Irish and Scottish with red hair. It's very typical that people from that part of the world have red hair. It's a specific gene that causes red hair. If you don't have that particular variant, you can't have red hair. Nobody is hurting from red hair, but it has some additional elements to it. Like, for example, they have very white skin, so they can be sensitive to the sun rays, etc. It doesn't have to kill them, if provided that they accept that they have this gene, and so they have to live differently. Same with the migraine. So we have a different brain. Our setup is different. We have a gene variant, just like red hair people do. And so we just have to accept it. And we have to make sure that we too, just like they need to stay out of the sun, we need to make sure we stay out of the world of carbohydrates. So it provides a lot of benefits otherwise, because our sensory organs are enhanced. We tend to hear more acutely. We tend to see a little bit better, particularly in dark. We smell much stronger. So most of us are very sensitive to odors. So we can detect gas leak. If you go back in ancestral times, we could probably have detected the lion in the bush 2 miles away from us. So there are some benefits But in our modern world, there are some disadvantages which we can tune out, provided we return to living in the way that we should have been living in terms of ancestral mode.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I remember reading in the anesthesia literature, look at the pain management literature, that redheads had a different sort of pain susceptibility. In fact, they may be more susceptible to pain than other people. And there was something consideration in people providing anesthesia would have to account for the fact that people have red hair. So there is something to that. Now, you mentioned that these people with this migraine sort of channelopathy genotype, has that been identified? Can you identify, is there a gene that says, hey, you have this gene variation, and therefore you have this channelopathy? Has that been identified yet?
I would say yes and no. So yes, because there are several articles that suggest that migraine is a channelopathy, but it's not just one gene. So if you go to the genecards.org, which is the human genome project, where they posted all the genetic variants for many health conditions. So you can just type in migraine and you're going to get the genetic output, and you can see the variants. And so all the variants that are listed among the most prominent ones, so they order them by importance. And the first 10 are all associated with ionic channel variances. And these ionic channels are the sodium potassium pump, the sodium, the glucose transporter sodium, which is something we should talk about, and also the magnesium, calcium. So all the ions, the ionic channels that are necessary and essential to work for the brain to release, to have the sodium coming to the cell, the potassium out to start the action potential, then to reverse, and to have the calcium come in with high voltage channels and to kick out the neurotransmitters on the other end. So these elements, for example, migraine brain also has been shown to have more calcium than other people do. So we have more calcium, but we need more salt, and we need more magnesium and more potassium and more water. But if you're not providing these 4 elements, then the excess calcium is going to cause trouble. This is one reason why some of the medications provided to migraineurs are actually calcium channel blockers, to block the activity, the overactivity of the calcium. And so the channelopathy is there. I'm not sure if it's one particular gene that is responsible for it, but it's many nucleotides within the brain of the migraineur, and it seems to be for all migraineurs because our symptoms are the same.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of, I've never had a migraine. In fact, I don't think I've even had a headache in my entire life. So maybe I certainly probably don't have that gene. When we talk about, I mean, you're talking about these, different channels and different electrolytes. And I guess my assumption is, with regard to the carbohydrate restriction, is that carbohydrates, or perhaps through insulin, cause a sort of a relative loss of these minerals. Is that the mechanism by which this is working, or is there something else besides that?
There are a couple of mechanisms that I can recall all of a sudden. One of them is, of course, is that as glucose enters the cell, it replaces actually sodium and water. It actually causes an efflux, meaning it kicks it out. And so one of the reasons why it kicks it out, if you envision that you have a cell that's full, I mean, we're not talking about empty cells, right? So there's no space in there. So glucose comes in, it's going to have to replace something. So what is it going to replace? Is going to remove those elements that it, number one, has a lot of. And if you look at a glucose molecule, it is a lot of water. It has a lot of hydrogen and oxygen molecules. Whether they will become water is another question. But glucose itself contains a lot of water as a result. And glucose also is attached to a lot of water. Glucose tends to hold on to water, just like salt, for example, holds on to water. And so in the cell, if you're looking at what happens when you take glucose, when you eat carbohydrates, they convert to glucose and they enter the cell, be it via insulin or via sodium. They enter the cell and they remove sodium and they remove water. So 2 key elements that we need for these channels to actually work, we suddenly removed. If we stop eating carbohydrates, we stop removing them. So then we don't need to replace so much of the salt and the water and the potassium and the magnesium, because we simply aren't removing these.
Yeah, there's a pretty well-known phenomenon in medicine with regard to insulin administration and potassium, hyperkalemia, for instance. If you have too much potassium in the blood, one of the strategies you can do is to give someone insulin, and it'll rapidly lower their potassium because it influxes into the cells.
Oh, yeah.
Is any of that occurring around this migraine situation with higher levels of insulin that you might be having on a carbohydrate-based diet?
So a couple of things here that is really interesting, that yes, you would say that insulin definitely holds onto sodium. It uses it as a tool to actually deliver glucose into the channels into the cells that don't use insulin, but use sodium instead. But there's another part to that, is that when you're looking at migraineurs in general, and I usually request everybody to have a huge blood test. So I have a list of about 30 elements that they need to get. Unfortunately, not all doctors support all of them, but most of the members can come at least with the fasting insulin. And when I'm looking at fasting insulin, then I can see that most of the migraineurs actually have low fasting insulin, yet still have insulin resistance. And this is something that I belong to an email group that we've been working on, and which is part of the metabolic multiplier group. And we just had an email exchange on how insulin happens. And one of our members put in a post showing how insulin from an oral glucose tolerance test for a person who's not a migraineur went from absolutely normal to sky high in an instant, and then within an instant back into pretty normal, not fitting any of what we would consider to be insulin resistant because it was really quick, but it went 5 times normal. So this is like a hyperactive insulin response. And so what I see on my migraineurs when they go for their insulin test, the fasting insulin is low, but when they go for an oral glucose tolerance test, their insulin goes sky high. And after that, it drops back to below normal. And I also have them test C-peptide, which is a good measure also of how well insulin is being used by the person. And C-peptide is doing the same thing. And so migraineurs seem to have, even if they have normal insulin levels to start with, they have a hyperreaction to glucose. And so that drives the problem. It isn't necessarily true that you have to have high insulin to start with. And there's no science behind this yet that I know of. Everybody's considering insulin resistance only in the perspective of hyperinsulinemia. And it isn't necessarily so. It may just be presented also as a hyperinsulin response to the glucose you eat. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you may be aware of the work of getting Joseph Kraft, who did a lot of the insulin responses in people that were, considered normal glycemic, not diabetics, but he saw a whole range of people's responses to glucose, to an oral, insulin to a response to an oral glucose challenge. Let me ask you about migraines, and do we have any data on migraines, say fMRIs, functional MRIs, or PET scans or something that show what's going on in the brain during the migraine? Do we have like uptakes of glucose, or can you look at uptakes of different electrolytes? I don't know if we were able to do that. Is there any information about that?
I don't think that I'm fMRI certified, as you know, so I could be running some of these experiments, but I don't think that have ever been any experiments with respect to glucose, because what I discuss and care with the glucose association of migraine, even though we know that glucose replaces sodium and water, it has never been really an accepted theory that glucose is the one that's causing the migraine trouble. This is new. This is my entire hypothesis. So nobody's tested that. It will also be considered to be unethical in some way by some of the medical boards too, or the ethical boards to run some of these experiments, because you can provide a person, for example, extra salt because it's considered to be unhealthy. And so I don't think that these experiments could be run. With this said and done, there are MRI and fMRI visualizations of what happens during a migraine. So we know how it starts and we know what actually happens, but they have never ever looked at the cause of migraines, at least not in humans. In animals, they have been inducing migraines. So we know how it starts, but they haven't been using the sodium, potassium, and the glucose variant in particular to those brains. They haven't.
How do they know that an animal's having a migraine? I'm just wondering how they know that.
They're just looking at what they're referring to as a cortical spreading depression. So that's a pretty good marker for migraine, and it doesn't happen in any other conditions. It is similar to what you would expect in a seizure, except in a seizure, it's like an explosion from one place to all over. Whereas in the case of a migraine, it goes from one spot covering the entire brain very slowly. I think it's just a couple of millimeters per minute. And so within about 30 minutes, it covers the entire brain. And so that is the aura phase. So people actually who have auras can see this physical activity happening in the brain, where basically a sodium current is moving from one part of the brain. I envision this as a CPR, for example, for paramedics. Like if you have a heart attack and they come with the electric machine and put it on and they initiate a huge voltage to restart the heart. And if there's enough nutrients then the heart can start pumping again. It's the same with the brain, except we don't have an external. Actually, we do, because now they also have equipment, the cephale, I believe is what it's called, the little machine that's on. It does the same thing. It's basically it sends a current, two pulses, negative, positive, and initiates a current in the brain. So the mechanism is understood very well. It's a problem of electricity within the brain. So in one spot or more, the brain simply stops being able to start an electrical current. And so when they reactivate the current, it stops the migraine. So we know it's a current. And we also know that current is started by sodium and potassium exchange in the cell. So the information is there. It's just that it doesn't pay for these people, to the medical industry, to look at salt and to look at sugar, because these are not just sugar, but carbohydrate, because these are not elements that they can use as medicine. This is nutrition, basically. It also in many ways is against the dogma in terms of the salt, for example, and also in terms of how much carbs we need. And so the experiments, even if they do exist or will exist, they will have serious trouble publishing it. So you won't be able to see them.
What is the sort of the epidemiology of migraines? Are they on the rise? Are we seeing more and more people having them, just like we're seeing more and more obesity and more, autoimmune disease? Are migraines increasing? I don't really know. I haven't really looked into that.
It's really hard to tell because, of course, nobody kept records. From what the number of years that I have followed and the kind of statistics that are available suggest that they don't increase, that they're pretty steady. But it's a little bit of a different situation because some people, for example, boys, may have migraine until they pass puberty and then they stop. And then women, for example, oftentimes don't start migraine until they're in their late 20s, early 30s. And so there's a time gap there. And so there's some overlap. And there's also that certain people start in different time range, age group time. And so we don't know, I don't know what the statistics is actually counting. Is it counting at any given year? There may be always a certain number of people, but it changes over the years for that person. And it may not change and other times. And also it seems that there is a variant, there's an island somewhere where it's a pretty locked down group of people who have lived there forever and they haven't been mixing with other communities, and their migraine ratio of the population is approximately, it's similar. It's a little bit larger than the general population we have, but it's pretty similar. So it appears to be not growing. So it isn't really driven, migraine is not driven by what we eat, but it's more of a state that a certain percentage of the people have the migraine gene, but because it has never been disadvantageous in terms of reproduction and survival, it just simply didn't wash out of the population. It just remained. And because there's no advantage to it today to have this kind of a migraine brain, it's not increasing. And so, but in this island where the population is just the pure original population, it's a little bit larger. I think in the general population today, it's like 12 to 15%, and I think they had 18 to 20%. So it's a little bit larger. So it was likely a larger group of people who had it because it was clearly some sort of a benefit. And now for the general population, it is not a benefit anymore. So maybe it is slowly reducing. Genes change. We now have populations that are completely capable of eating carbohydrates without getting diabetes from it. So we're adapting. It's possible that we will completely adapt out of migraine anytime, maybe thousands of years. I don't know.
But yeah, probably 1,000 years. Most of us won't be around.
Right.
I'm guessing. Maybe Dave Asprey if he takes enough supplements, according to him. But so 12 to 18%. I mean, that's 12 to 15%. That's a lot of people. That's 40 million people in the U.S. or thereabouts. Right. So Are there any other associated conditions with this? I mean, are migraineurs more likely to be diabetics, or what does the demographic typically look like?
Okay, so I would say that yes, there are lots of associated conditions. Clearly, because migraine is associated with the carbohydrate sensitivity or intolerance, whichever word you want to use, it is more likely that migraineurs will therefore somehow present with some form of diabetes or prediabetes or insulin resistance, which is not really clearly identifiable because we may not be overweight, we may not be having high blood pressure. In fact, we have low blood pressure. So it's going to be very difficult to identify a kind of a problem. We also tend to have, most migraineurs are also, it appears, have two other health conditions, which are really interesting. One of them is EDS, which is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is hyperflexibility in most cases. So many of us end up with very bad joints and there's not any kind of a connected part that I haven't yet dislocated. So there's going to be a lot of dislocation. Cervicogenic is strongly associated with migraine. As a result, it's not a migraine, but because we have really bad, very overly flexible joints, we get hurt with our neck, and our entire spinal system is going to be, our back, everything. I also found that some other things, for example, Raynaud's disease, which is an autoimmune condition, it's not really a disease. It's the one where you touch cold things and your fingers turn white, but the rest of your hand stays normal as it is. Also called urticaria, which would be itching all over from cold. These all seem to be associated with or connected to, I haven't run the statistics, but quite a few, large percent of people seem to have them. But these are all autoimmune conditions. And so it seems that once the migraineur stops eating carbohydrates, for example, in my case, I still have EDS, but I will not be continuing to extend those sensitive tendons, for example, because I'm not eating carbohydrates, so you're not going to get more damage. Raynaud's and urticaria, these disappeared. So they will more likely to have these, but it also will respond to the reduction of carbohydrates. So yes, they're associated with more of these conditions, but they will also disappear pretty fast once we start not eating carbs or reduce carbs at least.
And so you've been, I mean, you have a community that you've been looking at and doing this. So what has been the experience with the migraines, and do you find how effective? So my assumption is you're changing electrolytes and you're reducing carbohydrates. What has been the efficacy of that, and how does that compare to the traditional medicines that are out there?
I hate to say this, but it's 100%. So what I find, and also we know it's 100%, and many people said, well, it must be placebo. And I said, that's great. If it's placebo and it works is good, that's fantastic, because most of the migraineurs without any problem in a very short time come off of all their medications. And in time, all migraineurs come off of all of their medications. I have not taken any headache medication at all for the past 6 years. And so, and I was not on a host of medications. I have migraineurs who are on up to 40 medications, and they all titrate off. And once they came off, their migraines will come back, provided they retain their lifestyle of not eating carbohydrates or eating just the kinds that are acceptable, and they're increasing the salt. The salt is very important. And so the success rate in the group is 100%. We haven't had, we had a couple of people who were disgruntled because they had to quit some food and they didn't agree, and they left, and they're not migraine free, because if you just apply only part of the protocol, like you increase salt, but you continue eating grains and you continue eating all the vegetables with very high anti-nutrient value, you may not recover. You may be able to help a couple of migraines that are very specific only for salt need, but you won't be able to stop all of them. But if you follow the protocol completely, then it's 100%.
What is, how much salt are we talking about? And then I guess the question would be, if some people are going to still eat a limited amount of carbohydrates, does that amount of salt change?
That's a good question. And I didn't find that it does. But again, the migraineurs, when they come into the group, they immediately reduce the carbohydrate. So there is not a process. It isn't necessary that slowly they reduce the carbohydrate. Usually just quit or they move to the low carb, high fat. So I don't know if there would be any changes if they move from, say, low carb, high fat to, say, the ketogenic or to the carnivore very specifically. It's quite individual. I know that on the ketogenic diet, we all have to increase our sodium a little bit. And I find that on carnivore diet is extremely potassium rich, and so we need to also increase our sodium a little bit there. I don't know if it's very specific to the amount of carbohydrates, whether it's in or out of our diet, but I think it's more in terms of being able to balance the proper amount of potassium with the sodium. So the importance isn't really that you have a certain amount of salt, but rather that you have the right amount of salt given the amount of potassium that you eat. And then if you eat carbohydrates, then we all have a carbohydrate threshold, which is very interesting. If I eat over 5 grams of carbohydrates, I will feel my ankles starting to swell. And so this is very typical for migraineurs, that we start with edema. We may not even notice, but we will have edema around our eyes, our finger won't be able to remove our rings, etc. And so when that happens, then it's good to take just salt without water, and that's going to just pull the water back into the cells and is going to eliminate. So I don't know if you can consider this as taking salt, because the whole point of the edema is that this is the glucose that entered the cell, remove the salt and remove the water. And so when we take salt, we pull it all back and we urinate it out. So it isn't an excess salt per se. It isn't an increase in salt. We're replacing the salt that we lost as a result of taking the carbohydrates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's that, the water tends to follow the salt. So I mean, that makes sense to me. Let me ask you about blood pressure, because there's some people that are sodium sensitive to blood pressure. It's estimated, I think I've seen some people say 10-20% of the population of hypertensive people have a salt sensitivity, where the rest don't. Is there any relationship between that and migraines and does the fact that you're salt sensitive to blood pressure, does that impact this in any way?
You know, it's very interesting that you asked that. We had 2 people so far who joined our migraine group, who said we're salt sensitive, we can't have salt because, excuse me, we get salt sensitive hypertension. And then what happened was when they changed the diet, all of a sudden salt sensitivity disappeared. And so I don't think that this so-called salt sensitivity is really truly a true salt sensitivity. I think it is a metabolic phase as a result of what we eat. And so the moment we change what we eat, this is gone. And so we can then increase the amount of salt that we eat as a result. So I have not found anybody whose blood pressure increased as a result of increased salt. If anything, believe it or not, it actually decreases, because if you consider volume, if you consider the blood vessels as a pipe that is a set size, and you have a set amount of liquid in that pipe, and you now add additional salt and additional liquid to that pipe, it's going to expand. If it can't expand, your blood pressure is going to increase. And that's the point actually about hypertension, that it develops once the vascular system is inflamed and its flexibility is gone. But as long as your vascular system is healthy, and if you eat no carbohydrates, we know it is healthy, then basically salt retaining excess water in your blood, first of all, it's only going to be there for about 12 minutes, and I'm going to mention why. But while it is there and it increases your blood volume, it's going to be a relative increase because your blood vessels are going to expand, allowing the extra room, so your blood pressure isn't going to increase. But what I find is that if you're dehydrated, even if you're not a migraineur, I test this oftentimes on my husband, who comes in, well, I have high blood pressure, let me check. When was the last time you had water? Oh, I haven't had it for like 3 hours. I said, okay, here's a glass of water and salt. And I will take it and I will check his blood pressure 15 minutes later, and it normalizes. And that's because when you're dehydrated, your blood vessels are a set size, but the amount of blood you have in it is too low. And as a result, in order for the blood to be able to go through that entire blood vessel system that we have in our body as fast as it's necessary for it to deliver the proper amount of nutrients and oxygen, if you have less in terms of volume, it's going to have to go faster. And so that's going to increase your blood pressure in order to make the blood go faster. So actually, reduced salt and reduced water is going to cause an increased blood pressure, and an increased water, increased salt will reduce the blood pressure. So it's very counterintuitive if you're considering it that way. But I said earlier that within 12 minutes, the excess sodium is going to be removed from your blood. And it will be, because we have the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, whose job is to activate the kidneys to remove the excess sodium or the excess potassium or the excess water that we have. Its job is to manipulate our electrolyte to the particular osmolality that we have to have. So if we take an excess amount of salt, all of a sudden, for no reason, without any balance with water or with potassium, then within 12 minutes, our blood goes through the kidneys 5 times an hour. So every 12 minutes, our blood is cleared. So within 12 minutes, that excess sodium is going to be cleared out of the blood. So if you have a healthy system, and we have to say here that healthy system, because if you're not healthy, if you have hypertension, diabetes, any kind of a metabolic disease, cancer, whatever else other diseases you have, this is not going to work the same way, because your kidneys are going to be compromised to some degree. But if your kidneys are healthy, then there's no problem if you take a little extra salt. If the body thinks it's an excess salt, it's going to be excreting it, and it's called wasting. And if it considers that you have just the right amount because your brain is using more, and I think that's important to note that if there is an organ that needs more sodium than normally for other times and for other people, it isn't going to be excess. It's not going to be removed. It's not going to be considered as excess because you're using it. And there is a study from 1951 that shows that migraineurs excrete 50% more sodium in their urine. So they're using 50% more sodium. 50%, that's half as much more than normally other people would. So if you take only a quarter more than other people do, I'm still short with another quarter. So if you normally take 2,400 milligrams sodium, I, as a migraineur, will excrete a lot more than you do. Then that means I'm using 50% more. Then that means I'm needing 3,600 milligram sodium minimum, right? So that's not an oversupply. That's what I use.
Yeah, I don't know what I just pile it on a bunch of my steaks, and I have quite a bit of that. But hey, let me ask you about these ion channel fluxes and these channel activity. So in context of somebody's asking about what foods, carbohydrates could they include? Do you say rapid acting carbohydrates like the starches and simple sugars? Do they have a bigger impact than say like the slower complex carbohydrates, say the whole grains? Is there a difference? Are there certain foods that people can include outside of meat that seem to be less prone to cause migraines, or is there any rhyme or reason to that?
So it's very interesting. I just wrote a big thesis on this yesterday for one of my migraineurs in explaining that glucose is glucose. And so chemically, it's completely identical. It really doesn't matter if it's coming in as a teaspoon of sugar or if it's coming in from a plate full of spinach. The molecular structure of glucose is the same. And, there is a belief, and I'm saying it's belief, because I'm not trusting the nutrition science of the previous era. There's a belief that in complex carbohydrates, the amount of glucose that's in the carbohydrates is released in the system in a slower way. But I am not fully in line with this thought, and for the following reason. When we eat carbohydrates, be it sugar or be it anything else, we immediately in our saliva, we have very specific amylase and some other kind of enzymes that immediately attack the glucose. I mean, we have very specific receptors for these glucose molecules. And we can take the glucose out of just about anything right there immediately, except from lactose. And so I think that they immediately initiate an insulin release, which is a cephalic phase as well. Whether we eat glucose or we don't eat glucose, we release the insulin. So insulin is ready no matter what we eat. We just look at food or smell food and we're releasing insulin. And then when we eat the food, well, what happens? It goes in our stomach. And in our stomach, whether it is sugar from a teaspoon or it's in a spinach, it immediately separates, because in our stomach, we're using the acid and it separates them. There's nothing we can do with the fiber. So in our stomach, nothing is happening to the fiber. It immediately just passes on for the gut flora in our colon. Nothing is happening to it all through until it gets to the end point. We can't do anything with it. So I don't see how this would really impact or affect majorly how the glucose enters our bloodstream. There may be a little bit of a slowdown as a result of the difficulty of getting at the glucose at the molecular level. But within half an hour, there's going to be an equalization. So within half an hour from your eating your food, be it just sugar or be it the most difficult food to take the glucose out of, within half an hour, it's going to be out of there. And within 2 hours, all the food is going to empty from the stomach. So once it passes the stomach, it really is already separated into glucose and other factors. And I think that overall, the sum of all the glucose hitting the system has the same effect as the glucose coming in little parts. In other words, X amount of glucose is going to kick out X amount of sodium, whether it's coming out all at once or it's coming in steps, as long as it's within a certain amount of time frame, but there's no chance of renewal. And so if, for example, one is eating a lot of spinach, the total carbohydrate that we count in that, which is a net carb, which is a carbohydrate, total carbohydrate minus fiber, if it is the same as 1 teaspoon of sugar, it counts as 1 teaspoon of sugar. So we're looking at net carbohydrates. We're not looking at carbs. And we know fiber, and we know that some fiber, the soluble fiber, can become carbohydrate equivalent, can become glucose based on our gut flora. But they're going to use that glucose. We are not getting that. We're getting that as short chain fatty acids. And so I am not very fond of the suggestion that eating slow release and high fiber foods is any better, particularly not knowing what fiber is, and that it's basically an irritant. There's nothing we can do about it. And knowing that plants are full of anti-nutrients. So while we can certainly eat some plants, and I eat some plants, I eat fruits, I don't eat vegetables because fruits have the least amount of anti-nutrients in them. So I eat some fruits seasonally, time to time, whatever I feel like to. I go on carnivore as well as keto, whichever, or hypercarnivore, whichever I feel like eating. And that's totally fine. But boy, vegetables, I'm really not fond of them at all. I'm not fond of fiber at all. And I have migraineurs come into the group eating a lot of fiber. And I'm recommending them to not to. They all have constipation. They all have issues, acne, whatever. And the moment they stop all that, everything recovers perfectly. So I don't see any benefit of fibers at all. I don't know what your take is on this. I know literature is different, but I don't agree with it.
Yeah, I don't eat vegetables. I'm not a fan. I've never been a fan of them. People ask me if I miss them. I say, heck no, I never liked them in the first place. But let me ask you, there's a couple people here that have migraines and they're coming. One's saying that, you used to get migraine headaches, that they're not occurring, but she's still sometimes getting the auras that usually used to precede it. So what's going on there? And is that a concern still that you're getting the auras, but not the actual headaches?
Okay, no, it's not. And so let me tell you why. Because aura can be a kind of a migraine on its own. So typically many people who have auras don't have a pain. So in that case, the aura itself is the migraine. But the aura can also be what we call a prodrome. So a prodrome is something, it's an event that precedes the actual migraine. This is a time when we can act on that migraine. So I welcome the aura because I want to know that if I am not taking salt, if I'm not balancing my food, I'm missing some potassium, maybe I need to eat an extra avocado or an extra fish or steak. If I'm not aware that I need to do that, then I can't prevent my migraine. So the aura is a perfect example of my body telling me you're out of balance, eat to balance, and then the aura is going to stop. So that is one signal. We have many other prodromes, but the aura can be considered as a migraine on its own or just as a prodrome. In either case, it's the moment it starts, you're out of balance. You do what we call a salt test to see whether you need salt or you need potassium. And if it responds, and you can see the response right away. So if you take a little bit of salt, it's like under your tongue, you put it sort of absorbs right away without having to go into your stomach. If there's an improvement, the aura weakens, and then you just take more salt immediately, and it can completely stop the aura. If it doesn't respond to the salt, then that means you're lower in potassium. Then unfortunately, you're out of luck because potassium you can only take as food. We don't recommend supplement, and that takes about an hour, sometimes more, to be absorbed and to work as a potassium. But we can pretty much, anytime we need salt, and if the body needs that, and that's why we have the aura or migraine or any other kind of a prodrome, we can completely prevent the migraine. The potassium is a little bit more difficult because we need to know in advance at least an hour. So for example, pressure change, barometric pressure change, if it increases, then we need potassium, but we can see the forecast that is going to increase. And so then we can eat a lot of potassium in advance to sort of prepare. We have an hour at least to prepare for the increase so that our body is able to cope with that. So all of these factors we can control, and these are prodromes, these are symptoms that we catch, and then we can act upon it right away.
There's a question regarding alcohol, and is that a migraine trigger? Can you have alcohol and still be migraine free, or what's going on electrically with alcohol, I suppose?
Okay, so there are many factors with alcohol. One of them is that most of the alcohol that we drink are carbohydrates, like wine and most of the fermented elements, unless it's distilled. So distilled alcohol is different, but the other alcohols are carbohydrates. So we are then adding sugar back into the system. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that alcohol itself blocks all, this is not very well discussed and not very well understood, but there's plenty of literature suggesting that alcohol is a fuel. Alcohol has 7 calories per gram. So whereas fat is 9 and carbohydrates is 4, alcohol is 7, but alcohol is very toxic. So if you drink alcohol, the body shuts down all glucose or ketone burning and immediately burns alcohol, which also burns its ketones, by the way. But it burns alcohol, but it's creating a whole lot of ethanol, a whole lot of side effects and on a lot of issues, and it also dehydrates in the process. So it affects the electrolyte. And so this is why people who have hangover, if they simply drink salt water for the hangover, it's going to lift them out of hangover, because alcohol will dehydrate in the process of its metabolism. It's just so hard on the system, in addition to the fact that it shuts everything else down. And so if you eat a big meal and you're drinking alcohol with it, for example, and the meal contains carbohydrates, even if you just have carnivore diet and just eat a lot of meat, it's put on hold. There's nothing can happen until alcohol is in your system. And so protein synthesis will stop, everything will stop, because alcohol is in the picture, and so alcohol has to burn. And that means that all the food that you just ate is put on hold. And then when the alcohol is finally all burnt and used up, then all of the food that you ate suddenly will convert into glucose, do whatever it does. And that is another factor in that there's a time delay, and you will end up with a migraine as a result of the glucose hitting your system strongly at a different way, different time.
You mentioned quite a bit about sodium and potassium. Some of the other electrolytes, and you kind of touched on I think, calcium a little bit. They all seem to interact with each other. And somebody's asking about sort of magnesium. Is there sort of a recommended supplementation for that for migraineurs or other people, right, in what form? Because magnesium comes in many different
right. Forms. Migraine is coming in with my cat right now. I don't know if you can hear that. Migraineurs need also more magnesium. So a little back up for what magnesium does. Magnesium has a lot of functions in our cells, but in terms of the migraine brain and in terms of our brain in general, the action potential that we talked about earlier with channelopathy and how the sodium has to come in and the potassium has to go out, something has to open that channel, that gate has to be open. And so that is actually magnesium that opens up that channel. So you have magnesium attaching to an ATP molecule, and that activity pulls the channel, the gate open. So when the gate is open, the sodium can rush in and potassium can go out. And then as it changes to sodium going out and potassium coming in, then the gate closes. And at that point, magnesium is released. So magnesium is very important for the brain in terms of activating the action potential. So if you're taking extra salt, because we need extra salt, and we're eating a healthy potassium-rich food because we need extra potassium, and we have more than enough calcium, as I noted earlier, migraineurs have too much, and we're not supplementing magnesium, we're still going to end up with a migraine because we can't open those channels. So we still can't start the electrical activity of the brain. And so I recommend all migraineurs to take, we just recommend the RDA, which is 400 milligram magnesium for migraine. But there's a caveat, and that is that because our brains are so hyperactive, and magnesium, by the fact that it opens the gates through which the action potential starts, it can act as a stimulant for a migraine brain. And so migraineurs should not be taking magnesium at night. And that's just a bad outcome. That's nightmares and a sleepless night. So anybody who is a migraineur should really not take magnesium past 2 p.m. Magnesium half-life is very long. It's a couple of days. And so it is going to still affect you. I prefer to take my magnesium first thing in the morning as a result. With or without food, doesn't matter. It's better with food. But again, whatever we take has a half-life. Fat that you ate yesterday is still in you, is going to be in you for like 300 days. So there is really no need to supplement everything all the time. It's not an issue. Magnesium half-life, I think, is 2 or 3 days. And so you can even skip a couple of days, provided you sort of kind of make up for it. But you should be supplementing it as early as possible every single day, and approximately 400 milligrams. Some people seem to need more. It really is dependent upon the individual and how they're using the electrolytes and how active they are.
And as far as the formulation of the magnesium, is it magglycinate or magcitrate, or what's your recommended type?
Okay, so I created a formulation which I don't sell. I made it for a company, Health by Principle, that is 4 different types of elemental magnesium type. And that's because if I'm looking at each one of the magnesium types, elemental types, they each have certain specificity of where they work and what they do. Like citrate will, if you eat a lot of it, will cause diarrhea, for example. Some of the other ones, like oxide, are really not that good because oxide, well, it's oxidized. We don't really want to have rusted magnesium in us. So some of them are better than others. So I recommend a little bit of citrate, then of course glycinate, malate, and taurinate for the heart. So I mixed these 4 in approximately equal amounts, not quite equal because the elemental magnesium, different weights, etc. So I could only combine it in a certain way. But I have combined the 4, and these 4 don't cause diarrhea like too much citrate would. Help if people work out, and I recommend a lot of workout for migraineurs, particularly if they have sugar crash, for example. Then instead of eating, I recommend them to work out. And so magnesium is an element very important to also the muscles. And so in general, to support the whole body and all the organs for us, I recommend these 4. So that would be citrate, malate, glycinate, and taurinate.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on exercise and the thing about the sugar cravings or the food craving. Exercise, particularly acute bouts of exercise, tend to have an anorexic effect. That is, it shuts off the appetite for a while. And I imagine there's obviously exercise is going to obviously impact the brain, and I imagine some of those voltage channels and so on and so forth. And so let me, so in your community, and I don't know how big the community you're in, I know you had several thousand in before, but have you found that in addition to migraines improving, are you seeing other side effects from people switching to low carb, carnivore, keto diets?
Yes, everything possible, everything that you can see in your group. Of course, many of the migraineurs don't need to lose weight. So some of them actually overshoot because when they switch diet, they lose too much weight. And then the problem is, how do I gain weight? So we have different problems. But in general, what I found is, without exception, the allergies disappear. Everybody's arthritis disappears. We have a lot of people with osteopenia, but I insist on eating a lot of protein. Even if they eat just the low carb, high fat or the keto diet, my keto diet is a higher protein keto diet than the standard keto diet. And so many of them have started to get on a high protein diet, and one actually has increased her bone density score by 1 point, went from -2.5 to -1.5, I think, within like 6 months being on the carnivore. She's on carnivore diet. So the osteoporosis improves, asthma improves, allergies improve, the skin improves. I just discovered age spots improve. I used to have an age spot, and I keep on following it. And the aging itself, the glycination or glycylation of the particular skin cell. I used to have a big brown spot here, and I've been following it. That disappears. So there's a huge amount of benefits. In addition, of course, that we know that the brain improves, brain function improves. So dementia, any kind of seizures. Some migraines have seizures. I even had a couple of people reverse glaucoma, which is fascinating. I wrote about this already. It's medically suggested that they literally reverse it. So the doctor was surprised that it's gone. Of course, a couple of people now, we have a lot of people coming in who are not migraineurs. And so now it's a little bit blur of who's a migraineur and who is not a migraineur, because we have so many who aren't. But of course, type 2 diabetes is being reversed. Insulin resistance is being reversed. We have a couple of people coming in with serious injuries, head injuries, other injuries, many with a lot of surgeries. We even have multiple sclerosis, a host of injuries and diseases that seem to be more autoimmune in nature than is believed. And so they have been able to reverse it. And we have one person who I believe is part of Meteorx, whose client even has been eating on a low carb diet, and not carnivore yet, but a low carb, and even the client's health and all the family members, their health reverses. And I work with a lot of children from age 2 and up, and they too can have migraines and completely stop that. Acne disappears. So we're talking about just about everything. Everybody has way better sleep, and it's just a better life. They're hiking, they're weightlifting, they're moving out in the world and enjoying life. So it's an entire life change. It's not just that you're pain free, but you just change your entire life.
Yeah, I see those same things pretty much every day myself. So one of our members, I think Tansy was saying, she went from 20 migraines a day by following your sort of your protocol down to 0 now. So thank you for her. And then one other question, calcium and dairy, and then a lot of calcium, like milk, and for instance, is relatively high in carbohydrates. How does dairy impact folks with regard to migraines?
That is an excellent question, because they don't. It's really interesting. As the population, as we know, about 80% of the population out there is, I guess, is lactose intolerant, but migraineurs seem to be the other way around. We are like 90% lactose tolerant. So very few migraineurs actually are intolerant to lactose. So that already tells us something, that we are coming from a tribe or tribes that are used to drinking milk. And I went to see on Amazon Prime a documentary series called Tribes. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a documentary of four separate films. And what they did is they visit 4 different tribes. It's not the Hadza and the typical tribes that everybody's talking about. It's 4 completely unknown tribes who still today eat pretty much the way they used to eat, except they're no longer able to hunt, so now they herd. But they're nomadic, and they have the same kind of life. And what I've noticed, which is really fascinating, is that 3 out of the 4 tribes that herd, their main meal is actually milk. So they drink about 1 gallon of milk a day. They have all kinds of animals. They have sheep, lamb. They don't. I didn't say pig, but they have cattle, and they have even camel. And so they just put a cup on there, and they just get the milk and they drink it, and that's their meal. They don't eat meat every day because they can't hunt anymore. So they will only slaughter their own animals maybe once a week or some sort of a celebration reason. So the main meal is actually milk, and they also bleed their animals. So they will cut a little slit somewhere, and they'll let some blood out, and then they close the slit. So they don't kill the animal, they don't sacrifice the animal. They just keep on bleeding the animal, which then it gets regenerated, so it's not a problem for the animal. And they drink milk and blood. This is their daily nutrition. So when I'm looking at migraineurs, and we are so good with milk, this makes me question, are we from one of these tribes that basically live on milk? I had a couple of migraineurs who drank 1 gallon of milk a day without any problems and remaining in ketosis. So clearly, milk affects different people in a different way. So what I find is that migraineurs, by and large, most of them are very good with milk. I drink milk. I don't come out of ketosis from milk at all. And my ketones don't budge at all whatsoever. And of course, we eat a lot of dairy, like cheese, sour cream, etc. I'm not fond of fermented dairy, such as yogurt or kefir, because the fermentation process means that the bacteria broke the lactose up into glucose and galactose. And so when you put it in your mouth, it's glucose immediately. Whereas if you have milk, it goes to the duodenum, past the stomach, to break up into glucose and galactose. And so the absorption process is very different. So in the mouth, milk is not going to convert to glucose, but if it is yogurt or kefir, it does. And so I'm not fond of fermented dairy, but any other kind of dairy we like. Now, there's a caveat because I have a test in the group, which is a very similar test to the Kraft test that we talked about. And in that test, we also can see if somebody is having milk, for example, do they get a huge spike? Do they get a sugar crash, like a reactive hypoglycemia after? And if they do, that tells me that their insulin was overreactive to the milk. And then we can run what I call a spot test. So they will have a little bit of milk, just milk, being fasted, and a little bit of milk, and run a test for 1.5 to 2 hours with that milk only and nothing else. And I can see if they're reacting with their insulin in a negative way. Like if I drink milk, I will get a little bit of a spike and it's going to return to normal within 30 minutes. It's like I didn't have anything. Some people get a bigger spike and then they end up with reactive hypoglycemia, which means that the blood glucose becomes lower than what it was before they drank the milk. So that means it initiated a huge insulin response. For those migraineurs, I recommend to mix the milk with cream to reduce the effect of the insulin. And if they still can handle it, they may have to stop drinking milk, at least for the time being. Maybe once they're metabolically recovered, maybe then they'll be able to handle milk better. So they're testing then every dairy. They test the cheese, they test everything that they have with this particular spot test to see if their insulin is initiated into a huge spike. And if it is, then many of them, there are several who had to move to the zero carb, which is our version of the carnivore diet, without dairy. So that happens, but it's rare.
One last thing, Angela, you mentioned ketones and ketosis. Is that part of this protocol? Does being in ketosis facilitate being free of migraines, or is that essential, or is that just kind of an incidental thing?
Okay, so it is essential as well as non-essential. And so I'm going to explain it to different points. It is essential because being in ketosis means that you're using ketones instead of glucose. So that automatically means that the glucose is not going to enter the cells because you're not really using glucose. It's only used by those organs that must have it, like red blood cells, etc. But other organs that can use ketones will use ketones if you have ketones. And so you reduce the opportunity for your body to end up in a migraine as a result. But also that there's another factor to it, two other factors. One is that if I'm looking at people who are coming into my group now who are not migraineurs versus those who are migraineurs, if they eat the same food, the migraineur is going to be in ketosis and the non-migraineur will not be. So there's a difference between the two populations in that migraineurs tend to become or end up in ketosis really fast and remain in ketosis very strongly, very firmly. One of my migraineurs wanted to do an oral glucose tolerance test. It took her 2 months of training up to carbohydrate to finally be able to come out of ketosis. For most other people, it's 2 to 3 days. It took her 2 months. So there's a big problem there. But another thing that is important in terms of ketones is that what ketones do in the brain. So ketones are basically fat that are very, very small chain, very small molecules. And so they can cross the blood-brain barrier without any help. And this is important because migraine can damage the myelin. And we've talked about the myelin in the past, but not this time. So myelin is the insulation around each and every axon. And so it's the insulation of the brain, it's the white matter, it's also referred to. It's the biggest part of the brain. So over 60% of the brain is this myelin. And so both in the case of seizure, as well as in the case of migraine, the myelin is or can be damaged, different points of view and different mechanisms. But regardless, in order to rebuild the myelin, we actually need fat and we need cholesterol. These are the two things myelin is made of. And so by eating ketones, the ketones are fat. So we actually allow the brain to recover real well by being in ketosis. Whereas if we are not in ketosis, then there's no delivery mechanism of fat into the brain other than the brain creating its own fat or the DHA, which is something that can cross. but it isn't necessarily enough to repair the brain. And so the ketosis, the state of ketosis is pretty important in order to help the brain heal itself, which has to happen after. So migraine, it isn't just the migraine itself, but all the medications migraineurs get. Those literally damage the brain. If you're looking at medications that block calcium channels or sodium channels or potassium channels, well, what are they doing? They're filling up the receptors, which would allow these chemicals or nutrients into the cells. And so they literally degenerate the brain. They stop it from working. So something has to be able to rebuild, help the cells to rebuild these receptors. So ketones will allow this repair to actually take place at all and faster.
Okay, excellent point. Well, Angela, thank you. This has been a really wonderful, informative, information-packed hour. So for people who want to find you, I know you've got a book. Can you talk about your book and where do people go? And I got a Facebook group and anything else that you have that might be of interest to people? Let folks know.
So I have a book and I'm working on a new edition. The current edition is called Fighting the Migraine Epidemic Complete Guide. The word complete guide is important. It's a very big book. It's almost 700 pages. I'm trying to reduce it in a third edition to be a little bit smaller. I have 2 migraine groups on Facebook. I recommend all the migraineurs who are your members to join my primary migraine group, the protocol group, which is called Migraine Sufferers. So if you search Facebook for Migraine Sufferers, you're going to find it. The other group that I run is a more advanced group. So I don't actually allow people into that group until they are taking medications. That's a ketogenic group. And so they sort of have to earn their way into that group, because there we start fasting, we start ketosis, we start to do a lot of things that a regular migraineur would get a migraine from. So we can't start the ketogenic or carnivore diet with a sudden change or a fasting. It's just not possible without a migraine. So we have different methods. And so that group is the Stanton ketogenic diet for migraineurs. So these are the 2 groups. And then, of course, they can get a hold of me. I can be found under, I believe it's Angela A Stanton, PhD, one word, if you're looking for me on Facebook, on my personal wall. And I have a page, which is stantonmigraineprotocol.com, that they can also contact me via the contact form there.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, Angela. Have a great day. It's a great way to start this week off, and wish you the continued success you're having, and thank you for helping all those people. And like I said, we'll get you back on down the road again, if you're free, if you're open to it. This is a good message that needs to get out there to more and more people. So thanks for doing it.
Thank you, and hi and bye to everyone. I recognize a lot of faces I know. So bye.
Okay, guys, take care. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you guys back tomorrow. See you, everybody. Bye-bye.